In a standard economy, labor is a commodity. When a massive crowd floods the market for a single job, the individual worker becomes expendable, and the wage drops to a pittance. Supply outweighs demand, and the person disappears into the mass. But spiritual labor follows a different set of physics. When a monumental moral task is left abandoned by society, the value of the few who step forward to do the work scales to match the weight of the burden. In Urdu and Punjabi, there is a specific weight to the word mazduri. While it technically means day labor, it is used here to describe the unglamorous, agonizing work of maintaining moral integrity when the world around you has stopped valuing it. The most persistent laborer in history arrived exactly when that market for integrity had bottomed out, entering a world that had forgotten how to do the heavy lifting of character. 6th century Arabia had become a moral vacuum. Tribes were locked in blood feuds that lasted generations, and the social order allowed for the literal burying of infant daughters in the sand. This era of exploitation was interrupted on the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal with the birth of Muhammad. Contemporary accounts describe his arrival through the concept of nur, or spiritual light. Historical narratives claim his mother, Amina, saw a radiance so intense it illuminated the distant architecture of Syria from the streets of Mecca. Within a year, the region began to call this era Amul Fat, the year of rejoicing. Historical records note an end to local droughts and a sudden, universal pause in the practice of female infanticide, as families found themselves unexpectedly celebrating their children. This birth marked the official start of a lifelong labor. He was clocking in for a shift that would spend the next 63 years rebuilding the definition of human dignity. In the dense markets of historic Mecca, Muhammad was recognized as a laborer of trust long before he was recognized as a prophet. At 15, he was the driving force behind the Hilf el-Fudul, a civic pact created to ensure that any traveler or orphan robbed in the city streets would have their goods recovered by a collective of honest men. He spent 2 decades as a merchant in a cutthroat trading hub, yet never once cheated a partner or obscured a flaw in his goods. By the age of 30, the city's elites, even those who would later become his enemies, had given him 2 titles, El-Sadiq, the truthful, and Al-Amin, the trustworthy. Before a single verse of theology was shared, he had already spent 40 years establishing a track record of public integrity. He didn't ask for faith. He earned it through decades of undeniable character. We see his diplomatic labor at work right here, at the Kaaba. When he was 35, the structure was rebuilt after a flood. Rival tribes were on the verge of a civil war, drawing swords over which leader would have the exclusive honor of placing the black stone. His solution was a masterclass in ego management. He spread his cloak on the ground, placed the stone in the center, and commanded the head of every rival tribe to lift a corner of the fabric together. Once they raised it together, he placed the stone into the wall with his own hands. Every leader shared the credit, and the threat of bloodshed vanished. This was a rare form of labor, the ability to engineer unity among violent, fractured interests without needing to dominate them. There is a common historical claim that Islam spread primarily through military conquest. The data from the early years suggests otherwise. When the first 40 people accepted his message, they possessed 0 weapons and 0 political influence. They were an absolute minority, facing the full military and economic might of the Meccan establishment. The jagged terrain of Taif marks the site of his most agonizing trial. He entered this valley unarmed to share his message, only to be chased and stoned by the locals until his shoes filled with blood. When offered the chance to see the city destroyed in retaliation, he refused. He chose instead to pray for the future generations of the very people who were currently pelting him with rocks. This mercy began at home. In a culture that treated women as property, he set a new precedent, honoring his wife Khadijah as his primary intellectual partner and standing out of respect whenever his daughter Fatima entered the room. This empire didn't conquer through weaponry. It gained ground through a superhuman resilience of character that forced even his harshest critics to respect the man, even if they hadn't yet accepted the message. 23 years later, his earthly labor reached its conclusion at the farewell pilgrimage. Standing before this ocean of 144,000 companions, he was no longer an outcast. He was the architect of a new society. He asked the masses a final question: "Have I fulfilled my duty to you?" The thundering response was unanimous: yes. He looked to the sky and asked God to bear witness. The shift he had started 40 years earlier was complete. His physical presence was leaving, but he had installed a moral operating system designed to run as long as there were people willing to work it. Today, our world is once again deeply fractured. The demand for people of true integrity is higher than it has been in centuries, yet the supply of laborers remains low. The responsibility for this masduri didn't end with the companions. It is a baton passed directly to anyone watching this right now. In our tradition, we call this tajdid-e-ahad, the renewal of the pledge. It is the moment you decide to stop being a spectator. Clocking into this workforce means living a life of radical integrity. In your business, bringing unity to your family, and practicing mercy when it is hardest to give. To love the Prophet is to continue his work. Celebrating his birth is the invitation. Living his integrity is the labor.